Welcome to War Archives Black. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like to stay inside the operation.
Project Echo Chamber, the hidden war for American thought. In the spring of 1947, a man named Walter Collins sat alone in a windowless room beneath the Pentagon, listening to recordings of American families eating dinner. He wasn't listening for secrets, not in the traditional sense. He was listening for patterns, the rhythm of conversation, the silences between bites, the moments when a father's voice shifted from casual to certain, from questioning to convinced. Walter Collins was not a general, not a spy in the field sense, but something far more dangerous. He was an architect of belief, and the war he fought was one that left no bodies, no craters, only minds that had been quietly, invisibly reshaped. The files that documented his work were never meant to surface. They were stamped, sealed, and buried under classifications that even today remain partially redacted. But what leaked out, what whispered its way through declassified fragments and testimonies given decades too late, revealed something that changed the way we understand influence itself. This was not propaganda in the sense of posters and slogans, not the blunt force of wartime messaging. This was something more elegant, more patient, more total. It was called Project Echo Chamber, and it understood a simple, terrifying truth. You don't need to force people to believe something if you can make them think they came to that belief on their own. The Second World War had just ended, but the true battle was only beginning. The Soviet Union had emerged not just as a rival power but as an ideological threat, a system of thought that could spread without armies, that could infect minds across borders through nothing more than ideas. The American intelligence community understood this, and they understood that traditional warfare would not be enough. You could not bomb an ideology. You could not invade a belief system. But you could shape it, guide it, redirect it so subtly that no one would ever realize they were being led. Walter Collins had studied under Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, the man who had turned Freud's theories of the unconscious into tools for selling cigarettes and engineering consent. Collins understood that people did not make decisions through logic alone. They made them through emotion, through social pressure, through the deep, unspoken need to belong and to feel secure. And so when the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency came looking for someone to design a system that could influence an entire nation without that nation ever knowing it was being influenced, they came to him. The directive was clear but unwritten, passed down through closed-door meetings and conversations that left no paper trail. The United States needed to ensure that its population remained ideologically aligned, that dissent could be managed, that the narrative of American exceptionalism and anti-communist sentiment could be woven so deeply into the fabric of daily life that it would become invisible, as natural as breathing. They needed a method that would turn the media itself into a weapon, not through censorship or obvious control, but through something far more subtle. The illusion of choice, the appearance of free thought, all while every major outlet, every trusted voice, every source of information gently guided the public toward the same conclusions. Project Echo Chamber began with a simple experiment. Collins and his team selected 3 mid-sized American cities, carefully chosen for their demographic diversity, their media consumption habits, their voting patterns. In each city they identified the key influencers, the newspaper editors, the radio hosts, the community leaders, the voices that people trusted. These were not people who would knowingly participate in psychological manipulation. They were patriots, believers in the free press, in open debate. And that, Collins understood, was precisely why they would be perfect. The approach was indirect, elegant in its deception. Through a network of front organizations, think tanks with respectable names, cultural foundations with philanthropic missions, academic institutions hungry for funding, Collins' team began to feed information into the system. Reports on Soviet aggression, carefully curated to emphasize the most alarming elements. Studies on the dangers of communist infiltration, written by professors who genuinely believed in their findings but whose research had been quietly shaped by the questions they were encouraged to ask. The data they were given access to, the conclusions that funding seemed to reward. Opinion pieces that appeared in small journals, then were picked up by larger outlets, then became part of the national conversation, each step seeming natural, each amplification appearing organic. But the true genius of Project Echo Chamber was not in what it said, but in what it made others say. Collins had studied the psychology of social proof, the human tendency to believe something not because of evidence but because everyone else seems to believe it. And so the goal was never to convince people directly, it was to create the impression that a consensus already existed, that the things they were being told were simply common sense, the natural conclusion that any reasonable person would reach. When a housewife in Ohio heard the same concern about communist sympathizers repeated by her newspaper, her radio program, her church bulletin, and her neighbor who had read it somewhere else, it stopped being propaganda and became simply the way things were. The media became a hall of mirrors, each outlet reflecting and amplifying the others, creating an endless loop of reinforcement. A story would be planted in one newspaper, picked up by a wire service, repeated on radio broadcasts, discussed in editorials and referenced in congressional hearings, until it had been repeated so many times that questioning it seemed not just wrong but unpatriotic. And because each source appeared independent, because the journalists involved believed they were doing their own reporting, there was no obvious conspiracy to expose, no single puppet master to unmask. The system ran itself, self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing, an echo chamber in the most literal sense. By 1949, the initial experiment had been so successful that the program expanded nationwide. The techniques refined in those 3 test cities were now being applied across every major media market in America. But Collins understood that sustainability required more than just planting stories. It required building infrastructure, creating permanent channels through which influence could flow invisibly and indefinitely. And so Project Echo Chamber evolved into something more ambitious, more deeply embedded in the structure of American media itself. They began with the wire services, the arteries through which news flowed from coast to coast. A small number of gatekeepers could shape the information that reached millions. Collins' team didn't need to control everything these services published. They only needed to ensure that certain framings, certain narratives, certain ways of understanding events were consistently present, subtly prioritized, given just a bit more prominence than alternative interpretations. A word choice here, an emphasis there, a decision about which expert to quote and which to leave out. These tiny editorial decisions, multiplied across thousands of stories, created a gravitational pull towards specific conclusions. One of Collins' key innovations was what he called the cascade effect. He understood that journalists, despite their ideals of objectivity, were fundamentally social creatures who looked to their peers for validation and guidance. And so he created mechanisms to ensure that the most prestigious voices in journalism, the ones working at the papers of record, the ones whose bylines carried weight, would consistently frame stories in particular ways. Once the New York Times or the Washington Post established a narrative framework, smaller papers across the country would naturally adopt similar language, similar angles, similar conclusions, not because they were being directly instructed but because that's how professional credibility worked. You followed the lead of those who had already proven themselves, who had the resources for deep investigation, who set the standard for serious journalism. The Psychological Warfare Unit within Project Echo Chamber conducted extensive research on what they called narrative resilience, the ability of a story to withstand challenge and continue to shape belief even in the face of contradictory evidence. They discovered that the key was not the strength of the initial claim but the emotional investment people developed in the narrative surrounding it. If you could make someone feel that a particular story confirmed their identity, their values, their understanding of who they were as Americans, then facts became secondary to feeling. The story became true not because it was accurate but because it felt right, because abandoning it would require abandoning a piece of oneself. Television was just beginning its rise as the dominant medium, and Collins saw its potential immediately. Unlike radio or print, television created a sense of intimacy, of presence, of truth. When Walter Cronkite would later intone, "And that's the way it is," millions of Americans would believe him not because they had verified the facts themselves but because his face, his voice, his steady presence created a feeling of reliability. Project Echo Chamber worked to ensure that the people who would become these trusted faces, these authoritative voices, were ones who already shared the desired worldview, or who could be gently guided toward it through the same techniques of social proof and elite consensus that worked on the general public. But Collins also understood that television offered something radio and print could not: the ability to bypass critical thinking entirely through the manipulation of emotion and imagery. A news report about Soviet military exercises could be narrated in calm, measured tones, appearing objective and factual, while the accompanying footage showed tanks rolling through streets, crowds of gray-faced people, symbols of totalitarian control. The viewer absorbed not just information but feeling, and that feeling became inseparable from the facts being presented. Fear, pride, anger, hope. These could all be engineered through the careful selection and juxtaposition of images and sound, and the viewer would never consciously notice the manipulation because it bypassed the rational mind entirely. The psychological impact was profound and invisible. In focus groups conducted secretly as part of the project's assessment, Collins' team found that Americans genuinely believed they were thinking independently, that their opinions were their own, formed through careful consideration of diverse sources. They didn't feel manipulated because the manipulation was designed to feel like education, like information, like the natural process of becoming informed. A factory worker in Detroit would tell researchers that he had come to his own conclusion about the Soviet threat, never realizing that every piece of information that had informed that conclusion had been shaped, selected, and amplified by a system designed to lead him to exactly that belief. Collins kept detailed notes on these interviews, and reading them now is deeply unsettling. Subject after subject expressed confidence in their independence of thought, their ability to see through propaganda, their awareness of media bias. And yet when asked to explain how they had formed their opinions, they would inevitably cite sources that were all part of the same information ecosystem, all reflecting variations of the same narrative framework. They believed they were triangulating truth by consulting multiple sources, never realizing that those sources were all downstream from the same carefully managed information channels. But Collins understood that fear alone was not enough to sustain long-term control. Fear could motivate in the short term, but it could also exhaust, could lead to apathy or rebellion if sustained too long. And so Project Echo Chamber incorporated a second element: the creation of a positive identity to embrace, not just a negative threat to reject. American values, American exceptionalism, the American way of life. These concepts were refined, packaged, and disseminated until they became not just political positions but core elements of personal identity. To question anti-communist policy was not simply to disagree with a political strategy. It was to reject what it meant to be a good American, to threaten one's own belonging in the national community. This was perhaps Collins' most insidious innovation, the weaponization of belonging itself. Human beings have a fundamental need to be part of something larger than themselves, to know their place in a community, to feel that they matter and are understood. Collins turned that need into a tool of control by making certain beliefs prerequisite to belonging. It wasn't enough to live in America. You had to think like an American, which meant adopting a specific set of attitudes about freedom, capitalism, individualism, and the communist threat. Deviation from these attitudes didn't just mark you as wrong. It marked you as other, as outside, as potentially dangerous. The education system became another vector. Through partnerships with textbook publishers, through funding for curriculum development, through the selection of historical narratives that would be taught to every child in every classroom, Project Echo Chamber ensured that the next generation would inherit these beliefs as basic facts, as the foundation of their understanding of the world. A child learning about American history in 1952 would encounter a story that emphasized freedom and democracy in specific ways, that framed conflicts in particular terms, that made certain questions natural to ask and others unthinkable to consider. Collins personally oversaw the development of teaching materials for civics education, materials that are still, in modified form, used in classrooms today. The goal was not to teach students what to think but how to think, to establish the frameworks, the categories, the basic assumptions through which all future information would be processed. A child who learned that America represented freedom and the Soviet Union represented tyranny didn't need to be told what to think about each new development in the Cold War. The framework did the work automatically, sorting new information into pre-existing categories, making certain conclusions feel natural and inevitable. The brilliance of this approach was its sustainability. Collins didn't need to control the teachers. He only needed to control the materials they were given and the institutional incentives that shaped their professional development. A teacher who wanted to be considered effective, who wanted positive evaluations and career advancement, would naturally gravitate toward the approved methods and materials. Those who deviated, who questioned the dominant narratives, would find themselves marginalized not through overt punishment but through the subtle mechanisms of professional disapproval and limited opportunity. Hollywood, too, played its role, though many of the directors and writers involved would have been horrified to know they were part of a psychological operation. But the system didn't require their conscious participation. It only required that certain stories got made and others didn't, that financing flowed toward projects that reinforced the desired narrative and away from those that complicated it. The heroes in American films of this era were a particular type. Individualistic yet loyal to the system, rebellious in style but conservative in values, fighting against external threats that justified internal conformity. These were not accidents of creative choice. They were the natural result of an environment where funding, distribution, and critical acclaim all subtly favored certain narratives over others. Collins understood that entertainment was actually more effective than news for shaping long-term beliefs because people's psychological defenses were lowered when they were being entertained. They weren't analyzing, weren't fact-checking, weren't maintaining critical distance. They were emotionally engaged, identifying with characters, absorbing worldviews as part of the story experience. A movie that portrayed communists as sinister infiltrators or Soviet society as oppressive and gray didn't feel like propaganda. It felt like drama, like entertainment, like art. And precisely because it didn't feel like messaging, it went deeper, shaping not conscious opinions but unconscious assumptions about how the world worked. By 1953, Walter Collins had built something unprecedented. A self-sustaining system of ideological reproduction that required minimal active management because it had become embedded in the very structure of how information flowed through American society. Journalists trained in schools where certain framings were taught as professional standards. Editors promoted based on their alignment with established editorial positions. Audiences conditioned to find certain narratives comfortable and others dissonant. The echo chamber had become real, not as a conspiracy that could be exposed but as a set of institutional practices and cultural assumptions that simply seemed like the normal way of doing things. But there was a cost, one that Collins himself began to recognize in the final years of his life. In a memo written in 1967, found in his personal papers after his death, he expressed a quiet horror at what he had created. He had believed, in those early days after the war, that he was protecting democracy, that a population needed to be guided toward correct beliefs for their own good, for the stability of the system. But he had come to realize that what he had built was not protection but imprisonment, not guidance but control. He had created a population that could not think outside the boundaries that had been drawn for them, that experienced the illusion of free thought while remaining confined within predetermined limits. The memo was never sent, never acted upon. Collins died 6 months after writing it, and Project Echo Chamber continued, evolving with each new medium, each new technology. When cable news emerged, the techniques adapted. The multiplication of channels seemed to promise diversity, but Collins' successors understood that diversity of form could coexist with uniformity of content. Whether you watched CNN or Fox News decades later, whether you read liberal or conservative outlets, you were still operating within the same basic framework, the same set of acceptable questions and thinkable thoughts. The boundaries had been set so long ago that they were now invisible, experienced not as limits but as the natural edges of reasonable discourse. When the internet promised to democratize information, the strategy simply became more sophisticated, more fragmented, more personalized. The echo chamber did not disappear. It multiplied, creating not one shared reality but thousands of individual realities, each person living in their own carefully curated information environment, each believing they were thinking freely while being guided by algorithms and amplification patterns that Collins would have recognized immediately. The techniques he pioneered, social proof, narrative framing, emotional manipulation, the illusion of choice, these didn't become obsolete with new technology, they became more powerful, more precise, more capable of targeting individual psychology with messages tailored to exploit specific vulnerabilities and biases. One of the most chilling documents from the later years of Project Echo Chamber is a 1971 assessment of what they called generational transmission. The researchers had followed families from the original test cities, tracking how beliefs moved from parents to children to grandchildren. What they found was that the most successful propaganda was the kind that became culture, that transformed from ideas people had been taught into traditions they chose to pass down. A grandmother who had absorbed anti-communist narratives in the 1950s didn't teach her grandchildren to be suspicious of leftist politics through overt lessons. She taught it through comments at the dinner table, through reactions to news events, through the casual, offhand remarks that communicate values far more effectively than any formal instruction. The children who grew up watching those early television programs, reading those carefully curated textbooks, absorbing those Hollywood narratives, became the adults who built the modern media landscape. They didn't need to be controlled because they had internalized the control, had made it part of their own identity, their own way of understanding what was true and what was acceptable to say. They became the editors, the producers, the politicians, the teachers who would shape the next generation, passing down not through conspiracy but through culture the patterns of thought that Project Echo Chamber had established. Consider the case of James Morrison, a journalist who began his career in 1975, 30 years after Project Echo Chamber's inception. Morrison prided himself on his independence, his skepticism of authority, his commitment to asking hard questions. He had no knowledge of Project Echo Chamber, would have been outraged at the suggestion that his thinking was anything other than his own. And yet when researchers later analyzed his body of work, they found that his reporting consistently operated within the narrative frameworks that Collins had helped establish. His hard questions were always aimed at acceptable targets, his skepticism always stopped at certain boundaries, his independence existed entirely within a predetermined range of thinkable thoughts. Morrison was not controlled in any traditional sense. He was shaped by an environment that had been carefully structured decades before he entered it. The journalism schools that trained him, the newsrooms that hired him, the audiences that rewarded certain types of stories and ignored others. All of these had been influenced, directly or indirectly, by the infrastructure Project Echo Chamber had built. And so Morrison's independence was real in one sense and completely illusory in another. He was free to think anything he wanted, as long as what he wanted to think fell within the boundaries that had been set before he was born. And here is where the story becomes not historical but present, not about them but about us. Because the techniques that Walter Collins developed, the infrastructure he built, the understanding of human psychology he weaponized, none of it disappeared. It simply became normal, invisible, the background against which all modern media operates. We live in the echo chamber, all of us, and the most successful trick it ever pulled was convincing us that we were outside of it, that we were the ones who could see clearly while everyone else was being manipulated. Consider the news you watch today, the articles you read, the conversations you had about current events. Consider how much of what you believe you came to through independent thought and how much arrived prepackaged, framed in ways that made certain conclusions feel natural and others unthinkable. Consider how many times you have heard the same story from different sources and taken that repetition as confirmation rather than coordination. Consider how comfortable your beliefs feel, how they align with the people you respect, how questioning them would threaten not just your understanding of the world but your sense of belonging, your identity itself. This is the legacy of Project Echo Chamber. Not a conspiracy that can be exposed and ended, but a set of techniques so successful that they became the foundation of modern media, modern politics, modern public discourse. Walter Collins understood that the most powerful form of control is the kind that feels like freedom, that the most effective propaganda is the kind that doesn't feel like propaganda at all. He understood that you don't need to silence dissent if you can make dissent uncomfortable, unpopular, unthinkable. You don't need to ban alternative viewpoints if you can make them seem crazy, extreme, outside the bounds of reasonable debate. The newsroom became the battlefield, and the battle was won before most people realized it had begun. The living room became the front line, and the war was fought every evening at 6 o'clock, every morning with coffee and the newspaper, every moment someone turned on the television or opened a social media app and encountered information that seemed to be freely chosen but was in fact carefully selected, algorithmically amplified, designed to confirm and deepen existing beliefs rather than challenge them. Think about the last time you genuinely changed your mind about something important, something that mattered to your sense of who you are and how the world works. For most people, such moments are rare and often traumatic, requiring not just new information but a willingness to question everything that information rests upon. The echo chamber makes such moments even rarer by ensuring that the information you encounter consistently reinforces what you already believe, that the voices you trust confirm your existing worldview, that the narratives you absorb make sense only within the framework you've already accepted. Collins wrote in his personal journal that the greatest achievement of Project Echo Chamber was not changing what people believed but making them incapable of imagining they might believe something else. The goal was never to eliminate dissent entirely, that would be too obvious, too brittle, too vulnerable to collapse. The goal was to make dissent irrelevant by creating a population that couldn't truly comprehend alternative ways of understanding the world, that experienced different perspectives not as viable alternatives but as confusing, threatening, or simply incomprehensible noise. And perhaps the most disturbing part is that this system doesn't require evil people to maintain it. The journalists working today, the educators, the producers, the algorithm designers, most of them genuinely believe they're pursuing truth, serving the public good, enabling informed choice. They don't see themselves as propagandists because they operate within systems that define propaganda as something crude and obvious, something that other countries do. They've been trained to see bias as a matter of left versus right, never recognizing that the deeper bias is in the framework itself, in what counts as a legitimate question, in what possibilities are thinkable at all. The system perpetuates itself through people who believe they're fighting it, who pride themselves on their critical thinking and media literacy, who consume news from multiple sources without realizing those sources all draw from the same wells of information, all operate within the same boundaries of acceptable discourse, all reinforce the same fundamental assumptions about how the world works. Collins would have marveled at the perfection of it, a control system so total that the people most convinced of their independence are often the ones most deeply trapped within it. There are moments, though, when the system becomes visible, when the echo chamber reveals itself. These moments are usually quickly covered over, explained away, forgotten, but they happen. When multiple news outlets repeat the same story using identical language. When a narrative collapses under the weight of contradictory evidence but somehow remains influential anyway. When you find yourself unable to articulate why you believe something you're certain is true. When you notice that questions you want to ask are ones nobody else seems to be asking, and you wonder if the problem is with the question or with yourself. Walter Collins understood that these moments of clarity were the greatest threat to the system he'd built, and so he designed mechanisms to contain them. The label of conspiracy theorist, the accusation of extremism, the social cost of questioning consensus. These weren't accidents but tools, ways of ensuring that people who noticed the boundaries would be discouraged from speaking about them, or if they did speak, would be dismissed as unreliable, unserious, unworthy of attention. The war for American thought was not fought with weapons but with words, not with soldiers but with journalists who believed they were serving truth, with audiences who believed they were thinking freely, with a public that never realized they were the battlefield itself. And the war was won not on any single day but gradually, imperceptibly, as the infrastructure of influence became indistinguishable from the infrastructure of information itself. Collins' final journal entry, written 3 days before his death, contains a single question that he never answered. If I succeeded in creating a population that cannot think outside the boundaries I drew, who will be capable of recognizing when those boundaries need to change? It's a question that haunts the legacy of Project Echo Chamber, a question that remains unanswered even now. Because the systems Collins built were designed not just to shape thought in his time but to reproduce themselves indefinitely, to create conditions where the questions that would challenge those conditions become unthinkable. And so we arrive at the present moment, where the techniques of psychological warfare developed in those windowless rooms beneath the Pentagon have become the basic toolkit of modern media, where the distinction between information and influence has collapsed so completely that we no longer remember it ever existed, where the echo chamber has become so vast and so encompassing that there is no outside from which to hear our own voices repeated back to us. Propaganda doesn't shout. It whispers. And the world obeys. The quietest whisper is the one you mistake for your own thoughts. The most effective control is the kind you defend as your freedom. The successful war is the one where the occupied never realize they've been conquered, where they patrol their own minds more effectively than any external force ever could, where they pass the chains to their children and call it heritage, tradition, truth. This is what Walter Collins built. This is what we inherited. This is the war that never ended because it was never recognized as war. From the newsroom to the living room, from the textbook to the television screen, from the editorial board to the algorithm, the battlefield is everywhere and nowhere, visible only in its effects, undeniable only in retrospect, and by then far too late to resist. The echo never stops. It only grows louder. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. The echo never stops, it only grows louder. Subscribe to War Archives Black and remember, silence is control. Share this truth with someone still sleeping in the chamber. They won't thank you, but they might finally hear their own voice.